Greetings, fellow space travelers, BionicDance here. Now, as you can see, I'm not using the usual bells and whistles. I'm even letting you see the microphone. That's because, honestly, this is going to be a long video, and I just don't want to bother. Besides, if I sit over there in front of the green screen for too long, my ass starts to hurt. So I'm on the couch today. Now, as most of you know, I'm sick to death of William Lane Craig. The guy is sleazy. He comes off like a used car salesman or some back alley lawyer or something. I mean, he's just horrible. But I saw a recent debate he did with Sam Harris, and honestly, it needs responding to. So let's do this.
Our show tonight, as you already know, is a debate between William Lane Craig and Sam Harris, coming together for the very first time to discuss the question, are the foundations of moral values natural or supernatural?
Are the foundations of moral values natural or supernatural? I want you to pay close attention to that because it will become relevant later. One more time, are the foundations of moral values natural or supernatural?
Now, to begin with an important point of agreement, Dr. Harris and I agree that there are objective moral values and duties.
And you see, this is where Billy Craig takes this hard 90-degree turn. He's no longer talking about whether moral values are natural or supernatural. He's talking about whether they're objective or subjective. That's not what this debate was supposed to be about. And annoyingly, Sam Harris just goes right along with it.
To say that moral values and duties are objective is to say that they are valid and binding independent of human opinion. For example, to say that the Holocaust was objectively evil is to say that it was evil even though the Nazis who carried it out thought that it was good. And it would still have been evil even if the Nazis had won World War II and succeeded in brainwashing or exterminating everyone who disagreed with them so that everybody thought the Holocaust was good.
And on what basis do you make this assertion? Because unless you can actually show evidence that it's always wrong, this Holocaust, from outside of our minds, all you've got is a very strong subjective opinion. Sure, it's one I happen to agree with, but the Nazis had their own very strong subjective opinions. How do we know which one is right? How do we really know? I mean, I feel very strongly in one direction, and I'm going to defend that direction, and it's the anti-Nazi direction. I'm sure you would too. But where's the basis to say that it's anything other than opinion? You don't have such a basis. Oh, and it's only just the beginning of the debate, and you're already flirting with Godwin's law? Good job there, Billy.
What is not in question is that such a person has done something horribly, objectively wrong.
Except that it is a question. You can't just say that it's objectively wrong. You have to show that it's objectively wrong. I don't care how much you don't like it. I don't care how much I don't like it. It's still just our opinion.
The question before us this evening, then, is what is the best foundation for the existence of objective moral values and duties? What grounds them? What makes certain actions objectively good or evil, right or wrong?
No, that is not the question before you tonight.
Are the foundations of moral values natural or supernatural?
That is the topic before us. The subject is whether morals have a natural or supernatural basis. It has nothing to do with objective or subjective. But okay, let's take a hypothetical scenario. Let's suppose, just suppose hypothetically, that it really truly is objectively wrong to commit a Holocaust. Well, clearly the Nazis disagreed. They had their own personal subjective opinion on whether or not Holocausts are moral. Now, if objective morals can be disagreed with, if your subjective morality doesn't conform to this alleged hypothetical objective morality, then what does being objective even matter? It doesn't. I would submit to you that each and every one of us has our own personal subjective moral code inside of our heads. Now, thankfully, there's a lot of overlap between these moral codes, otherwise it would be chaos, but they are not all identical. And I would further submit to you that they are natural in origin. They come from survival, from evolution, from our brains, electrochemical activity. They are not imposed from without.
In tonight's debate, I'm going to defend two basic contentions. First, if God exists, then we have a sound foundation for objective moral values and duties.
Bullshit. What we would have is a magical celestial parent figure imposing rules upon us. That's not objective. That's God's subjective opinion, even assuming that God exists.
And second, if God does not exist, then we do not have a sound foundation for objective moral values and duties.
Which is, as I've pointed out multiple times now, not the topic of the debate.
Now notice that these are conditional claims. I shall not be arguing tonight that God exists.
Except that you actually have to. Because you're going to claim that morals not only come from a God, but that come from your God with the nature you claim that God has. And unless you can prove that any of that has any basis in reality, well, all you're doing is spinning fairy tales and expecting us to take it for granted that they have any validity whatsoever. And I'm not about to do that. Even if morals are supernatural in origin, even if they're objective in origin, that doesn't mean that your God is the source.
Here, I want to examine two subpoints with you. First, theism provides a sound foundation for objective moral values.
Yeah, you've got a holy rule book that has lots of dogma that contains rules that you're all supposed to follow. And these aren't human-created because... See why you have to prove the existence of God for us to take you seriously?
Moral values have to do with what is good or evil.
And what exactly determines this distinction, good versus evil? It's just a human abstraction. It's something that humans have created with their minds and is thus subjective. But if you're going to say that, no, God created the distinction between good and evil, well, isn't that something that God came up with in his godly mind? Isn't it just God's opinion? What makes these things mind external and thus objective?
On the theistic view, objective moral values are grounded in God. As St. Anselm saw, God is by definition the greatest conceivable being, and therefore the highest good.
But that's just your God. Why should we take your word that that's the God that exists? What if it's Ra, or Zeus, or Athena? They're not alleged to be the greatest gods ever. But if they determined morality, well, what then? Furthermore, you claim that your God is the greatest being ever? Well, why would he be the greatest good necessarily? Couldn't he be the greatest evil? And this is all on top of the fact that you haven't proved that your God exists.
He is, by nature, loving, generous, faithful, kind, and so forth.
Or so you say.
Thus, if God exists, objective moral values exist, wholly independent of human beings.
If God exists? Well, that's a really big if. And if your entire argument is predicated on us accepting this if, with no proof whatsoever, then you lose this debate.
Far from being arbitrary, God's commandments must be consistent with his holy and loving nature.
So your God can't choose to go against the grain once in a while? Then on what basis do you claim that he's omnipotent, assuming he's real at all?
Let's turn then to my second contention, that if God does not exist, then we do not have a sound foundation for objective moral values and duties.
Frankly, Billy, I don't give a shit, because I don't think that objective morals do exist, and even if they do, or don't, that's not the topic of the debate. Epic fail.
On atheism, it's hard to see any reason to think that human well-being is objectively good, any more than insect well-being, or rat well-being, or hyena well-being.
And this, I think, is the true basis for Billy Craig's position. The notion that he is not some uber special being, that he's above all the lesser animals, seems to offend or scare him, or both, or all three. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not, it's a hit to his ego, and he can't have that.
The purpose of Dr. Harris's book, The Moral Landscape, is to explain the basis on atheism of the existence of objective moral values. He explicitly rejects the view that moral values are Platonic objects existing independent of the world,
Which would make them subjective. Both Harris and Craig are wrong on this particular point.
So, his only recourse is to try to ground moral values in the natural world. But how can you do that, since nature in and of itself is just morally neutral?
And here is another example of Billy Craig's ego taking a hit, because we are part of the natural world. We are not separate from it. We are not higher beings. Like it or not, our personal morality came from natural origins.
On a naturalistic view, moral values are just the behavioral byproducts of biological evolution and social conditioning.
Let me play for you the relevant part of that clip one more time.
Moral values are just
Just. You see? Just. Billy Craig desperately needs morality to be some greater thing coming down from on high. Otherwise, his ego just can't take it. It doesn't matter what he can prove. It only matters what he wants.
just as a troop of baboons exhibit cooperative and even self-sacrificial behavior because natural selection has determined it to be advantageous in the struggle for survival, so their primate cousins, Homo sapiens, have evolved a sort of herd morality for precisely the same reasons. As a result of sociobiological pressures, there has evolved among Homo sapiens a sort of herd morality which functions well in the perpetuation of our species. But on the atheistic view, there doesn't seem to be anything that makes this morality objectively binding and true.
And maybe a cosmic rule book that cannot be challenged doesn't exist. But this is a possibility that Billy Craig seems unwilling, unable, and possibly even too scared to contemplate. But his entire argument is predicated on this notion that there is such a rule book, one he's unwilling to even attempt to prove.
Take God out of the picture, and all you seem to be left with is an ape-like creature on a speck of dust beset with delusions of moral grandeur.
Let me once again play for you the relevant portion of this particular segment.
Take God out of the picture, and all you seem to be left with,
All you're left with. Is there any doubt in anyone's mind after this that this really is about Billy Craig's ego?
So how does Sam Harris propose to solve the value problem?
Now, how is this for sleazy tactics? Billy Craig is supposed to use his first 20 minutes to make his own case for his own side. Rebuttals come afterward. But not only is he starting to rebut his opponent's position, but he's making his opponent's position for him before he gets a chance to speak. Billy Craig is a sleazeball con artist. Is there any doubt?
He says we should define good as that which supports the well-being of conscious creatures.
And you're objecting to this definition? What the hell is yours?
At the end of the day, Dr. Harris isn't really talking about moral values at all.
Well, I ask again, if moral values are not about maximizing well-being and minimizing harm, then what the fuck are they?
He hasn't provided any justification or explanation for why on atheism moral values would objectively exist at all.
Well, actually, Billy, he has done a lot more toward that end than you have. Because if, as he apparently claims, morality comes from science, from evolution, from social and environmental pressures, well, what could be more objective than that? Objective means mind external, true regardless of opinion. Now granted, as I said before, everyone carries their own slightly varied version of morality in their heads, but I also stated that there's a lot of overlap, and that overlap comes from those environmental pressures, from mind external sources. That is much more objective than you claiming God done it.
His so-called solution is just a semantical trick of an arbitrary and idiosyncratic redefinition of the terms good and evil in non-moral vocabulary.
You know, Billy, instead of just taking it for granted that your audience knows what you mean when you say things like non-moral vocabulary, you really need to define your terms. Because the best we've gotten from you about good or evil, moral or immoral, is God says so. And that's not good enough.
Natural science tells us only what is, not what ought to be the case. As philosopher Jerry Fodor has written, science is about facts, not norms.
Except that's not entirely true, is it? Because if we take a large enough sampling of one class of living entities, we can certainly find out what is most common, and therefore their norm. And these norms are circumstantial. There's not one rule for all creatures. This doesn't leave a lot of room for your God, who allegedly made one rule for everybody to follow. These circumstantial rules in nature allow a lot of latitude for differences, and we can see them in action, unlike your alleged divine oughts.
In particular, it cannot tell us that we have a moral obligation to take actions which are conducive to human flourishing.
Actually, Chester, that's exactly what they do. It's an integral part of natural selection, survival of the fittest. A species which did not feel such an obligation would most likely be wiped out rather quickly.
So, if there is no God, what foundation remains for objective moral duties?
Possibly none. Even the morals I just described can be easily disagreed with. And what does this hard-on you have for morals being objective anyway? Why do you need that so badly? Well, I think I answered that already. It's because a world without them scares you.
On the naturalistic view, human beings are just animals.
Just animals.
And animals have no moral obligations to one another.
Bullshit, they don't.
When a lion kills a zebra, it kills the zebra, but it doesn't murder the zebra.
Now that's a rotten example. When a hunter kills a deer, he doesn't murder the deer. Why don't you talk about the obligations humans feel toward each other, or that lions feel toward each other? You ever see that mama lion defending her cubs?
When a great white shark forcibly copulates with a female, it forcibly copulates with her, but it doesn't rape her. For none of these actions is forbidden or obligatory. There is no moral dimension to these actions. So if God does not exist, why think we have any moral obligations to do anything?
Because we find those obligations useful. We like pleasure. We don't like pain. We like living in a society that flourishes, that advances itself and promotes that well-being. Our moral obligations are to ourselves, to the human race as a whole. And there is no God required. Do you deny that obligations can be imposed by humanity? What obligates us to, say, pay back student loans or to make house payments? Why can't we just skip out on those obligations? And why can't we just skip out of moral obligations too, even if they're imposed by a God? The truth is that we can, but there are potential consequences to doing so which we find unacceptable. And there is an unspoken mutual agreement among people to reciprocate acceptable behavior and to withhold harmful behavior. No, these are not hard and fast rules that everybody has to obey. As I said before, we're all improvising, and I realize that this uncertainty may be uncomfortable, but I also realize that this may be tough noogies. Why can you not reach the same conclusion?
On the atheistic view, certain actions such as rape and incest may not be biologically and socially advantageous, and so in the course of human development have become taboo, that is, socially unacceptable behavior. But that does absolutely nothing to prove that such acts are really wrong.
Can you explain what really wrong even means? Without these socially imposed norms, right and wrong are just abstractions. There is nothing there to determine what they are, except that you claim there is. So, what?
If there is no moral lawgiver, then there is no objective moral law. And if there is no objective moral law, then we have no objective moral duties.
Well, then I guess we'll just have to make do with our subjective morals. And, once again, this in no way addresses the actual topic of the debate, which is the origins of morality, not their position on the objective-subjective spectrum.
Sam Harris believes that all of our actions are causally determined, and that there is no free will.
Which I suppose would also mean that the imposing and enforcing of moral values is also causally determined. Doesn't mean they don't exist.
But if there is no free will, then no one is morally responsible for anything.
But what is your actual objection to this notion? Do you have any evidence to show that it isn't the case? Or is this just yet another example of you finding it unacceptable and therefore rejecting it?
Now, as many of you know, I've spent a fair amount of time criticizing religion.
That's right. It's finally Sam Harris's turn.
The sense is that without the conviction that moral truths exist, that words like right and wrong and good and evil actually mean something, humanity will just lose its way.
Exactly.
I actually share that fear.
Wait, what? This is the reason why Sam Harris is my least favorite of the Four Horsemen.
Let's say we found a culture that was literally removing the eyeballs of every third child, okay, at birth. Would you then agree that we had found a culture that was not perfectly maximizing human well-being? And she said it would depend on why they were doing it. So after my eyebrows returned from the back of my head, I said, okay, well, let's say they're doing it for religious reasons. Let's say they have a scripture which says every third should walk in darkness, or some such nonsense. And then she said, well, then you could never say that they were wrong.
Well, let's just let that one sink in for a minute. Religious reasons equals never wrong. Really?
Okay, now here is where religious people, like Dr. Craig, begin to get a little queasy, as I think they should. Okay. And many see no alternative but to insert the God of Abraham, an Iron Age God of war, into the clockwork as an invisible arbiter of moral truth.
And if you read between the lines, what Sam Harris is basically saying is that morals are natural in origin, not supernatural, and that God is made up. I may not agree with his notion that morals are objective or universal, but I think he gets this one right regardless.
Okay, it is wrong to cheat on your spouse because Yahweh deems that it is so. Okay, which is curious because in other moods, Yahweh is perfectly fond of genocide and slavery and human sacrifice.
Yeah, this Yahweh character is not a particularly nice fellow, according to my morality. But if you listen to people like Billy Lane Craig, well, Yahweh can do no wrong. Everything he does is moral, no matter who it hurts.
I must say, it's pretty amusing to hear Dr. Craig in his opening remarks say that I'm merely focused on the flourishing of sentient creatures on this planet. Okay, if that's a sin, I'll take it. Okay, one wonders what Dr. Craig is focused on.
Ooh, burn.
Now, incidentally, you should not trust Dr. Craig's reading of me. Half the quotes he provided from me, as though I wrote them, were quotes from people I was quoting in my book, and often to different effects. So,
yeah, you remember what I said before about Billy Craig being a sleazeball, used car salesman con artist type?
imagine a universe devoid of the possibility of consciousness. Imagine a universe entirely constituted of rocks. Okay, there's clearly no happiness or suffering in this universe. There's no good or evil. Value judgments don't apply. For changes in the universe to matter, they have to matter at least potentially to some conscious system.
Which, let's face it, is at least half an argument in favor of morals being subjective instead of objective.
Now, if you think the worst possible misery for everyone isn't bad, or maybe it has a silver lining, Or maybe there's something worse. I don't know what you're talking about. And what's more, I'm pretty sure you don't know what you're talking about either.
Well, at least that's a much better definition of bad or evil than Billy Craig's complete non-definition of the same terms.
Questions of right and wrong and good and evil depend upon minds. Okay, they depend upon the possibility of experience.
Which would make them subjective. They're dependent upon experience and perspective. They are not external to the mind. They are not universal. Thus, they are not objective.
Minds are natural phenomena. They depend upon the laws of nature in some way.
Which is really all that needs to be said. Minds are natural. Morality is a product of the mind. Therefore, morality is natural, not supernatural.
It's clearly possible to value things that will reliably make you miserable in this life.
And other people can look at you and not get it. Values are clearly relative, and morals are a kind of value.
Okay, if someone doesn't value evidence, what evidence are you going to provide to prove that they should value it? If someone doesn't value logic, what logical argument could you provide to show the importance of logic?
The best you can probably do is find some goal they'd like to accomplish, and then show them how logic and evidence are the only path to success, that other routes lead to failure. Even then they may not believe you, but if they're even reasonably intelligent, this example should convert them to a logic and evidence valuing person. Should.
Professor Craig now has 12 minutes for a rebuttal.
Oi, back to this chowder monkey again.
Moral ontology asks, what is the foundation of objective moral values and duties? Moral semantics asks, what is the meaning of moral terms? And I am not making any kind of semantical claim tonight that good means something like commanded by God. Rather, my concern is moral ontology. What is the ground or the foundation of moral values and duties?
But you absolutely need the semantics to do the ontology. If you don't know what good or evil actually mean, then how can you figure out what their basis is, what their origin is? You're firing your gun at a target that isn't there.
To give an illustration, think of light. Light is a certain visible range of the electromagnetic spectrum. But obviously that isn't the meaning of the word light. People knew how to use the word light long before they discovered its physical nature.
But as with your example with the lion and the zebra, this one is pretty terrible. In this particular case, light is visible. We can see it. It's not stored in our brains, in our minds. We can manipulate it. We can create it or extinguish it. Light is a physical, objective thing, whereas morality is not.
Now, in exactly the same way, we can know the meaning of moral terms like good and evil, right and wrong, and know the difference between good and evil without being aware that the good is grounded in God ontologically.
Except that it's not true. Not everybody agrees on what good and evil mean, or which actions, which behaviors are one or the other, or even if they exist at all. So until and unless you define your terms, searching for an origin is completely pointless, since we'll have no idea what we're even looking for.
So that is the position I'm defending tonight, is that moral values are grounded ontologically in God.
And I'm saying that if that's what you're doing, you've already lost this debate.
So we've not heard any objection to, here the only response I detected from Dr. Harris was,
well, maybe, you douchebag. That's because Sam Harris used his first 20 minutes to make his own case rather than defend against your initial 20 minutes. And he saved any rebuttals for the second round where we are now, as the moderator stated in the format description. You ever think of that?
Dr. Harris said you don't need religion in order to have universal morality. Again, that's a confusion. Of course you don't. Remember, the Nazis, for example, could have won World War II and established a universal morality. The issue isn't universality. The issue is objectivity.
No, it isn't, you lying, manipulative dork nozzle. The subject is whether or not morality has a supernatural or natural origin. You are the one who changed the subject on us.
Now, Dr. Harris says, but we can imagine creatures being in the worst possible misery, and it's obviously better for creatures to be flourishing. The well-being of conscious creatures is good. Well, of course it is. That's not the question. We agree that all things being equal, flourishing of conscious creatures is good. The question is rather, if atheism were true, what would make the flourishing of conscious creatures objectively good?
Are the foundations of moral values natural or supernatural?
You've tried to reset the parameters of the debate to something you think is easier to defend and which you think supports your position better than the original question. And I'm calling your ass on it.
Now here, Dr. Harris, I think, is guilty of misusing terms like good and bad, right and wrong, in equivocal ways. He will often use them in non-moral senses.
Senses which you continue to not define. All you'll say is that Sam Harris is getting it wrong.
Now, since it's possible that human well-being and moral goodness are not identical, it follows necessarily that human well-being and goodness are not the same as Dr. Harris has asserted in his book. Now, it's not often in philosophy that you get a knockdown argument against a position, but I think we've got one here by granting that it's possible that the continuum of well-being is not identical to the moral landscape. Dr. Harris's view becomes logically incoherent.
It's only incoherent if you insist that morality be objective instead of subjective, which it isn't.
Moral obligations or prohibitions arise in response to imperatives from a competent authority.
And here we see Billy Craig's disconnect. He's making this assumption that moral obligations and prohibitions come from an authority, and that this authority is external to our own minds. And he's wrong. Moral obligations are a gestalt of biological and social pressures ingrained into us from the first moments our brains achieve consciousness. To claim that they must be handed down from an authority begs the question of this authority's existence, expecting us to take this assertion for granted. And I'm not biting.
For example, if a policeman tells you to pull over, then because of his authority, who he is, you are legally obligated to pull over. But if some random stranger tells you to pull over, you're not legally obligated to do so.
Which, like all of your analogies so far, Billy, is a terrible one. Equating legal obligations with moral ones misses the point entirely. Yes, laws are handed down from an authority, but those are not the only kinds of obligations. For example, suppose you made a bet with a friend, $10 if your team wins the game, or whatever, and you lose. You're obligated to pay up to your friend, aren't you? But by what authority? You only both agreed, with nobody enforcing the terms of the wager but your own honor. Not all obligations come as commandments from on high.
Now, in the absence of God, what authority is there to issue moral commands or prohibitions? There is none on atheism.
So what are you saying to us, Billy? That you have no conscience? That without God enforcing it, you wouldn't give a shit about other people? Is that what you're saying to me here?
Dr. Harris now has 12 minutes.
Okay. So God created the cultural isolation of the Hindus. Okay. He engineered the circumstance of their deaths in ignorance of revelation. And then he created the penalty for this ignorance, which is an eternity of conscious torment in fire. Okay, on the other hand, on Dr. Craig's account, your run-of-the-mill serial killer in America, okay, who spent his life raping and torturing children, need only come to God, come to Jesus on death row, and after a final meal of fried chicken, he's going to spend an eternity in heaven after death. Okay. One thing should be crystal clear to you. This vision of life has absolutely nothing to do with moral accountability.
Bada bing.
You know, something good happens to a Christian. He feels some bliss while praying, say, or he sees some positive change in his life, and we're told that God is good. Okay, but when children by the tens of thousands are torn from their parents' arms and drowned, we're told that God is mysterious.
Or that it was the evil machinations of the devil. But you're totally right. If anything bad ever happens, it's never laid to rest at God's doorstep. Ever.
And if God is good and loving and just and kind, and he wanted to guide us morally with a book, why give us a book that supports slavery?
I've got to skip ahead a little bit on this one, because Billy Craig's response to it is just facepalm worthy.
And Dr. Harris continues to press the point, oh, but the Bible supports slavery. Again, I'll refer you to Professor Copan's book, which shows that that is a gross misrepresentation of ancient Israel, which did not, in fact, promote slavery as we understand it in light of the experience in the American South.
Oh, it wasn't slavery as we understand it. Right. Were people made to work and they weren't allowed to leave? Slavery.
According to Dr. Craig's divine command theory, God is not bound by moral duties. God doesn't have to be good. Whatever he commands is good. So when he commands that the Israelites to slaughter the Amalekites, that behavior becomes intrinsically good because he commanded it.
In other words, God is the perfect excuse for moral question begging.
Okay, just think about the Muslims at this moment who are blowing themselves up, okay, convinced that they are agents of God's will. There is absolutely nothing that Dr. Craig can say against their behavior in moral terms, apart from his own faith-based claim that they're praying to the wrong God.
Precisely.
Now, I'm obviously not saying that Dr. Craig or all religious people are psychopaths and psychotics.
And yet?
It is absurd to think that people like Professor Peter Van Inwagen here at the University of Notre Dame is psychopathic, or that a guy like Dr. Tom Flint, who is as gracious a Christian gentleman as I could have ever met, is psychopathic. This is simply below the belt.
I'm thinking someone don't listen too good, huh?
But this, to me, is the true horror of religion. It allows perfectly decent and sane people to believe by the billions what only lunatics could believe on their own. If you wake up tomorrow morning thinking that saying a few Latin words over your pancakes is going to turn them into the body of Elvis Presley, okay, you have lost your mind. Okay. But if you think more or less the same thing about a cracker and the body of Jesus, you're just a Catholic.
Kind of like how the only difference between a cult and a church is how many people in the congregation.
That it's a very strange sort of loving God who would make salvation depend on believing in him on bad evidence.
Oh, don't even get me started on faith. We'll be here all fucking night.
This doctrine is astride a contemptible history of scientific ignorance and religious barbarism. We come from people who used to bury children under the foundations of new buildings as offerings to their imaginary gods. I mean, just think about that. In vast numbers of societies, people would bury children in post holes, people like ourselves, thinking that this would prevent an invisible being from knocking down their buildings.
Man, people are dumb. And I will never quite understand humanity's fetish for the pointless sacrifice. It's like some sort of religious masochism.
If there is a less moral framework than the one Dr. Craig is proposing, I haven't heard of it.
Professor Craig now has 8 minutes for a rebuttal.
The less moral framework is atheism. Atheism has no grounds for objective moral values or duties.
Here, have a nice tall glass of been there, done that.
Well, in the last speech, we heard some attacks on my first contention that God provides a sound foundation for morality. Unfortunately, it seems to be that most of these were red herrings.
Yeah? Well, your entire position is a red herring. You went and changed the subject right at the beginning, and unfortunately, Sam Harris ran with it.
You don't believe in God to avoid going to hell. Belief in God isn't some kind of fire insurance. You believe in God because God, as the supreme good, is the appropriate object of adoration and love.
Then why the threat of hell for non-belief? You'd think that wouldn't be necessary so long as you were just a good person. And yet it's there.
He then responds, but there's no good reason to believe that such a being exists. Look at the problem of evil and the problem of the unevangelized. Both of these, as I explained in my opening speech, are irrelevant in tonight's debate because I'm not arguing that God exists.
then you've already lost the debate. Because the debate is not about some hypothetical origin of morality. It's about whether morality has a natural or supernatural foundation. And if you're going to claim it has a supernatural one, then you have to prove that that supernatural origin does in fact exist. Otherwise, you're not fulfilling the criteria of the debate, and you've already lost.
Notice, secondly, I would want to say, evil actually proves that God exists.
Ha! God is evil. I knew it.
Because if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. If evil exists, it follows that objective values and duties do exist, namely some things are evil.
Once again, Billy Craig begs the question that good and evil are objective values. Does he ever have any new arguments?
So you cannot press both the problem of evil and agree with my contention that if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist.
And I think it should be obvious that I don't agree with your contention. So where does that leave us?
He says, but then what about people like the Taliban who say that God has commanded them to do certain atrocities? I would say the very same thing to the Taliban that Dr. Harris says, namely, God did not command you to do those things.
An assertion for which you have exactly zero evidence.
That's exactly what Dr. Harris would say. The reason he thinks that is because he doesn't believe that God exists, but I would say that because I think that the Taliban has got the wrong God.
Really? Because just a few seconds ago you said this.
I'm not defending the Bible tonight. I'm saying that for a theist, whether Jew, Christian, deist, Hindu, moral duties will be grounded in the divine commands which are based in his nature.
So how do you square claiming the Taliban has the wrong God with your claim that it doesn't matter which religion you're in, morality will just come from God's divine nature? Which is it?
So I don't think this first contention is really in much dispute tonight. I think it's obvious that if God exists,
the God you refuse to attempt to prove, thus rendering your entire position merely hypothetical and not fulfilling the criteria of this debate,
then obviously objective moral values exist independently of human opinion.
But not independent of divine opinion, thus rendering them subjective.
So the real debate is on that second contention. Can atheism provide a good foundation for objective moral values and duties? And I think we've seen powerful reasons to think that it cannot.
And I think we've seen powerful evidence that you're a conniving liar who changed the subject and terms of the debate.
Dr. Harris now has 8 minutes.
Well, perhaps you've noticed Dr. Craig has a charming habit of summarizing his opponent's points in a way in which they were not actually given. So I will leave it to you to sort it out on YouTube.
Yes, you will.
In any case, Dr. Craig has merely defined God as being intrinsically good.
Do you realize it took you nearly an hour and a half of debate to finally bring that up? It would have been one of the first points I raised, as evidenced by this video.
Thinking about moral truth in the context of science should only pose a problem for you if you imagine that a science of morality has to be absolutely self-justifying in a way that no science ever could be.
Which, frankly, sounds to me like a roundabout way of saying that morality really isn't objective.
So there are subjective facts. If you happen to have an intact nervous system, being burned alive will be excruciatingly painful. The painfulness of pain is a subjective fact about you.
This is true. Some people experience completely different amounts of pain from exactly the same stimuli. Spicy food, for example.
And by this light, we can see that it's possible to value the wrong things. I mean, if you think you prefer to be neurotic and in pain and incapable of creative work and completely disconnected from other people, there's something wrong with you.
See, here I don't agree. People prefer what they prefer. Sure, it may be outside the norm, perhaps even objectionable to the rest of us, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're broken.
You are closed to higher states of consciousness. Higher with respect to what? Higher as in further from the lowest possible state of consciousness, the worst possible misery for everyone.
But that's actually a subjective standard. If what is pain to us is pleasure to them, if what we'd find objectionable is their idea of paradise, who are we to say that there is something wrong with them? I can't stand country music and gangsta rap. I bet some people hate the pop punk and 80s rock I adore. Each of us would find the other's taste to be the lowest form of music appreciation. Which of us is right? I figure that morality is really about not doing anything to anyone against their will, and not about conforming to some standard imposed from without.
Okay, given that people have had these remarkable experiences in every context, while worshiping one God, while worshiping hundreds, while worshiping none, that proves that a deeper principle is at work. That the sectarian claims of our various religions can't possibly be true in that context.
And of course, William Lane Craig's entire argument is predicated on the notion that just one of those claims is true.
All we have is human conversation to capture these possibilities. We can either have a first century conversation as dictated by the New Testament, or a 7th century conversation as dictated by the Quran, or a 21st century conversation that leaves us open to the full wealth of human learning.
Well, I certainly know which one I'd prefer.
We're now moving to 5-minute closing speeches.
First, I argued that God, if he exists, provides the sound foundation for objective moral values and duties. By the time of his last rebuttal, the only argument that I heard Dr. Harris offering against this position is to say that you're merely defining God as good, which is the same fallacy I accused him of committing. I don't think this is the case at all. God is a being worthy of worship. Any being that is not worthy of worship is not God.
But see, you just did it again. You defined God as a being worthy of worship. And if the being isn't worthy of worship, it's not God. That's your definition. Doesn't match mine. Plus, by that definition, well, I consider George Lucas worthy of worship. Is George Lucas God? And what about gods like Thor or Zeus or Ra? Are they not worthy of worship in your world? But they're still gods. I'm sorry, but this definition just doesn't work. It's pretty logically incoherent.
So once you understand the concept of God, you can see that asking, well, why is God good, is sort of like asking, why are all bachelors unmarried?
Well, that's provided we accept your definition of God, which I do not.
He says, well, there are different senses of the word. Objective, yes, of course. And in my opening speech, I made clear the sense in which I was defining the term.
In other words, attempting to take control of the debate, just the way you did when you changed the topic from being about the origin of morality to whether or not it's objective.
I mean valid and binding, independent of human opinion.
Binding? I don't so much think so. Indisputable, perhaps, but not binding.
He says science can study subjective facts. For example, pain is a subjective fact. Granted, that's certainly true. So my question is the wrongness of an action a subjective fact?
Abso-fraggin-lutely it is.
On atheism, it's hard to see how it couldn't be anything more than a subjective fact, in which case you cannot say, as Dr. Harris wants to say, and I agree with him, that the genital mutilation of little girls is objectively wrong, not just a subjective opinion.
But if we object to such a practice and we're willing to enforce that position, what more do we really require? Oh, I know, you want our morality to be binding, something everybody must follow. It's a plea for certainty, revealing just one more facet of that fear of the unknown that I pointed out earlier.
And now Dr. Harris has 5 minutes.
Okay, the problem is that everything Dr. Craig has said tonight, with a few modifications, could be said in defense of Islam. In fact, has been said in defense of Islam. Okay, the logic is exactly the same. We have a book that claims to be the word of the creator of the universe. It tells us about the nature of moral reality and how to live within it.
And it took you to the end of the frickin' debate to finally point this out? Come on, man, get with it.
What are the chances that we're all going to go to hell for eternity because we haven't recognized the Quran to be the perfect word of the creator of the universe?
Well, I'm certainly prepared to play those odds.
Please know that this is exactly how Christianity appears to someone who's not been indoctrinated by it.
Exactly. And yet Billy Craig's entire argument seems to be based on the notion that Christianity is the one true religion.
The only tool we need is honest inquiry. And I would suggest to you that if faith is ever right about anything in this domain, it's right by accident.
That gives us 30 minutes for questions.
Oh no, screw that. This video is long enough already, and I'm pretty sure you get the idea. So until next time, fellow space travelers, this is BionicDance saying don't run on automatic. Instead, please think. Please take the time to rate this video. And hey, if you dig what I do, subscribe. And please visit my Zazzle store, where you'll find all kinds of BionicDance merchandise. People not subscribing to BionicDance is one sign of the apocalypse. Save us all. Subscribe now.